I never imagined that something as simple as owning water would become the ultimate weapon in a war I never asked for. But when the HOA decided to go too far, poisoning my water supply was their biggest mistake. They didn't know who they were messing with. I'm not just a homeowner. I own the water, and with it the power to fight back. It all started innocently enough. Pine Crest Gardens was everything I had dreamed of when I moved into the neighborhood. A quiet, well-maintained community where families lived in harmony, and neighbors greeted each other with a smile. My garden, my pride and joy, was no exception. My sustainable, self-sufficient approach was simple. I used rainwater to feed my plants. I'd always been a little different, and collecting rainwater was a small way I could contribute to the environment. Nothing too radical, just a couple of blue barrels, hidden behind a fence, collecting water from the gutters of my house. I never thought anyone would mind. I followed the rules, paid my dues, and kept to myself. But when I got that letter from the HOA, the one with Pine Crest Gardens logo stamped in gold, it changed everything. Dear Mr. Mitchell, the letter began, and I could already feel the blood rush to my head. This notice serves as a formal warning regarding unauthorized structures on your property. My heart sank. I hadn't done anything wrong, had I? My rainwater tanks, those innocuous blue barrels, had been there for over 2 years without a single complaint. In fact, they were almost invisible from the street. But according to the HOA, they were in violation of some obscure regulation about unsightly structures. It didn't make sense. They were barely visible, let alone unsightly. I folded the letter, my hands shaking, and marched straight to my neighbor Tom's house. Got one too, huh? He asked before I could even speak, holding up his own letter. Judith's on another power trip, he said, shaking his head. Judith Winters, the new HOA president, had taken control only 6 months ago, and things had already started to feel different. People were scared. The gardens that once flourished now looked sterile and uniform. Fences were painted the same dull beige. It was as though a once vibrant community had been drained of its life. I wanted to scream. This wasn't just about the rain barrels, it was something bigger. I could feel it. Something was off, and I was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. The letter from the HOA set off a chain of events I couldn't have anticipated. My life, once peaceful and fulfilling, now felt like it was teetering on the edge of disaster. I mean, how could something as trivial as rainwater collection turn into a full-fledged battle? It wasn't just that the HOA had decided to target my rainwater collection system. It was the underlying tone of the letter, the threat of fines that loomed over my head. They didn't give me a choice. I had 7 days to remove the tanks or face daily fines of $100. That was $3,000 a month. Money I didn't have, not on my teacher's salary. How could I afford that? I wasn't about to just roll over and let them take what was mine. The next day, I called the number listed on the letter, my stomach churning with a sense of dread. The voice on the other end was smooth, practiced. Pine Crest Gardens HOA, Marcus speaking. I took a deep breath before responding. This is James Mitchell at 1478 Sycamore Lane. I received a notice about my rainwater tanks, but they're completely hidden from view and comply with city code. The response was immediate. Let me check your file. I could hear the tapping of keys as Marcus scrolled through my information. Yes, the board has determined that your water collection system violates Section 8.3 of the Covenant regarding unsightly structures. Unsightly? I repeated, frustration creeping into my voice. They're hidden behind my fence. No one can even see them from the street. The response was condescending. Perhaps Pine Crest Gardens isn't the right neighborhood for your alternative lifestyle choices. My blood boiled. Alternative lifestyle choices? Collecting rainwater was not a radical act. It was responsible. But the HOA treated it like it was some kind of rebellion. I wanted to scream, but I kept my voice steady. I'd like to appeal this decision, I said, trying to remain calm. You're welcome to address the board at next month's meeting, Marcus replied. Until then, the removal deadline stands. I hung up, feeling helpless. The HOA was relentless, and they weren't going to back down. But I wasn't going to let them take my garden. It wasn't just any garden. It was my legacy. My grandmother's heirloom tomatoes, pepper varieties I'd spent years cultivating. These weren't just plants. They were pieces of my history. They mattered, and I wasn't going to let anyone destroy them. I called the city planning office next. The woman on the other end of the line was sympathetic but firm. Your rainwater system is absolutely permitted under code, she confirmed. But HOAs can enforce stricter rules if they're written into the neighborhood's covenant. I was stuck. The HOA had the power to impose rules above and beyond what the city allowed, and I was at their mercy. But something inside me refused to back down. The days that followed were filled with frustration and dread. I couldn't stop thinking about that letter, about the looming deadline, about the $3,000 fine I couldn't possibly afford. As I tended to my garden, I kept my eyes on the rainwater tanks, now a target for the HOA. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. The next morning, I drove down to City Hall and picked up a copy of the neighborhood's original covenant. It didn't mention rainwater collection, nor did it include anything about unsightly structures. The whole thing felt like a setup. I went through the covenant with a fine-tooth comb, hoping to find a loophole, something that could save me. Back home, as I watered my plants for what might have been the last time, I noticed something strange. My elderly neighbor Elaine, who had lived in Pine Crest Gardens longer than anyone, was watching me from across the fence. I waved her over. "I heard about your trouble," she whispered, looking around nervously. "Judith did the same thing to the Garcias last month. They had solar panels installed, and she made them remove them. Couldn't believe it." "What did they do?" I asked. Elaine's eyes narrowed, her voice lowering. "They gave in, removed the panels to avoid fines." "But James," she paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Be careful. Last year, before you moved in, a man named Raymond stood up to Judith about his koi pond. 2 days later, all his fish were dead. Nobody could prove anything, but—" Her voice trailed off. The warning sent chills down my spine. Were they capable of this? Could they really poison my garden to force me out? My gut told me they were, but I wasn't going to let them win without a fight. That night, I installed a small security camera overlooking my backyard. It seemed paranoid, but Elaine's warning kept replaying in my mind. For the next 3 days, I checked the footage religiously. Nothing. I was beginning to wonder if I had overreacted. Then, on the 4th night, the camera detected motion. I rushed outside and found a figure slipping along my fence line. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't make out their face, but it wasn't hard to guess who it was. Marcus Jenkins. He was the HOA compliance officer, and he had access to everything. I checked my tanks. The first 2 seemed normal, but when I peered into the 3rd, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. The surface of the water didn't reflect the light properly. Something was off. I didn't sleep that night. My mind raced as I considered the possibilities. Could Marcus have done something to the water? Could he have poisoned it? I grabbed my flashlight and examined the tanks more closely. The water in the first 2 looked fine, but in the 3rd, something didn't seem right. I didn't waste any time. At dawn, I filled 3 sample containers with water from each of the tanks. I rushed to my friend Sarah, who worked in the chemistry lab at the community college. She promised to run the tests and let me know as soon as possible. When I got the call around noon, my stomach dropped. Sarah's voice was tight with concern. "James, you need to listen to me. The 3rd sample you brought contains dangerously high levels of copper sulfate and glyphosate. It's industrial-grade herbicide, and it's toxic. Don't use it on your plants. Don't even touch it without gloves. If this chemical leaches into the soil or groundwater, it could cause serious environmental damage." I felt the weight of the situation hit me all at once. Someone had poisoned my rainwater tanks, and it wasn't an accident. The HOA had taken things way too far. They didn't just want to bully me, they were trying to destroy everything I had worked for. I rushed home, my hands shaking as I disconnected the irrigation system from the 3rd tank. I could only hope that I had stopped it in time. Later that afternoon, Tom came over, sensing something was wrong. I showed him the lab results and his face darkened. "We need to check my security footage," I told him. Someone was in my yard last night. Tom and I huddled around my laptop, scanning through the grainy footage. At 2:17 a.m., the camera caught a figure in a dark jacket, the unmistakable Pine Crest Gardens logo on the back. The figure paused briefly, facing the camera, Marcus Jenkins. The footage showed him pouring something into my third water tank before disappearing back over the fence. "This is criminal," Tom whispered. I nodded, feeling a cold determination replace my fear. I had proof. I wasn't going down without a fight. "I'm going to the police," I said. Tom hesitated, putting a hand on my shoulder. "James, wait. Judith's husband plays golf with the police chief every Sunday. Be ready for them to call this a civil matter." I stared at him, the weight of what I was up against finally sinking in. This wasn't just about my rainwater system anymore. It was about power, control, and the HOA's willingness to do anything to crush anyone who stood in their way. If they thought they could get away with poisoning my garden, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I didn't sleep that night. The images of Marcus's face on the security footage replayed in my mind over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in a nightmare. The rainwater, my garden, everything was at risk. I had always believed in fairness, that if you followed the rules and did things the right way, you'd be protected. But clearly, the rules didn't matter to Judith Winters and her HOA cronies. They were above the law, or at least they thought they were. I spent the following morning trying to process everything. I knew what I had to do next, but I couldn't go to the police yet. Tom was right. Judith had friends in high places, and I didn't trust them to act on this the way I needed. This wasn't just some petty dispute about rain barrels anymore. This was personal. They had crossed a line. I spent the rest of the day in my garden, feeling helpless as I examined the damage. The leaves on my rare heirloom tomatoes had started to curl, and some of the pepper plants were wilting. I couldn't just watch my garden die. I had to act fast, but I wasn't sure what to do. That afternoon, I received a text from Tom. "We need to meet. I have something you need to see." I didn't hesitate for a second. I grabbed my keys and headed straight to his house. Tom was waiting for me at the back door, his face grim. "I think I've figured out how they're doing it," he said, motioning for me to follow him inside. He led me into his kitchen, where he laid out a series of documents and photographs. "This is bigger than I thought," he said, tapping a photo of the HOA's landscaping contracts. "Judith's brother-in-law just started a new landscaping company. He's the one getting all the contracts for Pine Crest Gardens. And look at this." Tom slid a folder across the table, revealing financial records. "It's not just the rainwater tanks. They've been selectively targeting homeowners with self-sufficient setups. People who have solar panels, gardens, anything that reduces their reliance on the HOA's approved vendors. They want to force people like you out so they can control the landscaping business." My stomach churned as I looked at the documents. Judith's HOA wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about money, power, control, and they were using people's homes and livelihoods to line their pockets. Couldn't let them get away with it. "We need to go public with this," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "I'm not just going to sit back and let them poison my garden, my property, for their own gain." Tom nodded. "I agree, but we need more evidence. If we're going to take this to court, we need to connect all the dots. This has been going on for too long, James. We need to build a case." He was right. This wasn't just about me. It was about the entire neighborhood. I had been living in a place where people were too scared to speak out, too scared to fight back against the HOA. But that was about to change. That evening, Tom and I gathered the neighbors at his house. We needed to make sure we weren't alone in this fight. The fear that had kept everyone quiet was starting to crack. The more people learned about what was happening, the more they realized they weren't the only ones being targeted. By the time I arrived, the house was already buzzing with energy. Elaine, the retired chemistry teacher, was there, along with the Rodriguez twins, whose pool permit had been mysteriously delayed. Maria Garcia, who had lived in Pine Crest Gardens longer than anyone, was also there, her face determined. Tom gestured to the table where documents and evidence were spread out. I think it's time we take this seriously, Maria said, pushing a thick folder toward me. We've been documenting every selective enforcement, every property damage incident. We've been too scared to act, but enough is enough. We're not going to let them push us around anymore. I opened the folder, flipping through pages of meticulously documented incidents. Denied permits, unexplained fines, and property damage that just so happened to affect people who had spoken out against the HOA. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about my rainwater tanks. Judith was systematically targeting people who didn't conform to her vision of what Pine Crest Gardens should look like. We need to connect with more people, Elaine said, her voice steady but urgent. We need to make sure we have enough support to take down Judith. I nodded, my resolve hardening. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that if we were going to take on the HOA, we couldn't do it alone. We needed the whole community behind us. I wasn't just fighting for my garden anymore. I was fighting for all of us. As the meeting continued, we discussed legal strategies, ways to document the ongoing abuses, and how we could present our case. But it wasn't just about legal tactics, it was about building solidarity. The more we shared, the more we realized that we weren't alone in this. And that made all the difference. The following day, something shifted. The neighborhood was abuzz with talk of what we could do next. The HOA's stranglehold on Pine Crest Gardens was suffocating the life out of the community. But we had a plan, and it was time to put it into action. The idea came to us in a moment of frustration and defiance. What if we made a statement? A big one. A message that the HOA couldn't ignore. Something that would get their attention and show them that we weren't afraid of them anymore. One of the neighbors, Mr. Jenkins, a retired logistics manager, was the mastermind behind the plan. He had experience in organizing operations with precision, and he knew exactly how to pull this off. Our mission: deliver a not-so-subtle protest to the HOA office. We were going to fill it with manure, fresh, pungent manure. At first, I wasn't sure about the plan. It sounded extreme, but the more we talked about it, the more it felt like the only option. Judith and her cronies had taken everything from us, our right to live in a peaceful, self-sufficient community, and it was time we made them understand just how serious we were. We spent the next few days preparing. We bought hundreds of pounds of manure from a local farm, making sure it was fresh and potent. We coordinated everything: the timing, the roles, the logistics. No one could afford to make a mistake. It was a Friday night when the operation went down. Tom and I, along with several neighbors, gathered outside the HOA office. We worked quickly, unloading the manure from the trucks and carefully positioning it throughout the office. As the pungent smell filled the air, I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. This was the message we needed to send. By the time we were finished, the office floor was covered in manure. The walls, the desks, nothing was untouched. But we didn't just do this for revenge. We did it to make a statement. We left behind a flash drive with the security footage of Marcus poisoning my water tanks and documents proving the HOA's corruption. Before we left, we made sure the office was secure. We weren't vandalizing the place, we were sending a message. The office was covered in manure, but no equipment or documents had been damaged. It was the perfect protest. The morning after our little operation, we were all waiting for the inevitable fallout. Judith wasn't going to let this slide, and we knew it. We also knew that this was only the beginning. When I checked my mailbox, there it was, an emergency HOA meeting notice. The board was calling for a special meeting, and they were making it clear that this was about the criminal vandalism of community property. It was their way of turning the tables, making us the bad guys. But we had the upper hand now. We had evidence and we had the truth on our side. Tom and I arrived at the community center for the meeting, which was packed with residents. This was the moment of truth. The HOA had pushed us to the brink, but we were fighting back. The whole community was standing together now. Judith couldn't intimidate us anymore. When the meeting started, Judith immediately tried to make it about me and my actions. "Mr. Mitchell," she sneered, "you have openly admitted to vandalizing community property." But Tom had anticipated this. As the projector clicked on, the room fell silent. The footage of Marcus poisoning my water tanks flashed across the screen for everyone to see. Judith's face drained of color as the video played. Her voice echoed in the room, clear as day. Once his precious garden dies, he'll have no reason to fight the tank's removal. The entire room was in shock. Judith had no defense. And then, Sophia Jenkins stepped forward, her hands shaking as she revealed that the footage came from her father's dash cam. The evidence was irrefutable. The meeting room fell into stunned silence as the footage played on the screen. Marcus Jenkins, the HOA compliance officer, was clearly seen poisoning my water tanks. Judith Winters, the HOA president, was implicated in the scheme. Her voice was unmistakable as she talked about using my garden as leverage to remove my water tanks and take over the landscaping contract for the entire neighborhood. The more the footage played, the deeper the pit in Judith's stomach seemed to grow. She knew the game was up, but she wasn't going down without a fight. "Mr. Mitchell?" Judith began, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "This is absurd. This footage has been tampered with. It's all lies." She banged her gavel, hoping to regain control of the room. But the damage was done. The truth was out there, and it wasn't going anywhere. Sophia Jenkins, Marcus's daughter, stood up, her face pale but resolute. "That's my dad's dash cam footage," she said, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It records automatically when his car starts. You just didn't know I had access to the cloud backup." The room erupted in murmurs as everyone realized that not only had the HOA gone too far, but now they were facing real consequences. Judith's face twisted with fury, but she had no more excuses. Marcus, who had been sitting quietly beside her, suddenly slumped in his chair, unable to look anyone in the eye. He knew the game was up. The evidence was overwhelming. But we weren't done yet. We had to finish this. Elaine, who had been quietly watching the whole ordeal, stood up. She had brought with her the water sample reports from the lab, along with a chemistry textbook in hand. "The chemicals Marcus used are dangerous," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Copper sulfate and glyphosate are industrial-grade herbicides. They're not only harmful to plants, but they can also contaminate the soil and water table. This isn't just about ruining a garden. It's about poisoning our environment." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The community was no longer silent or afraid. People who had lived in Pine Crest Gardens for years, afraid of the HOA's power, were standing up, one after another, to demand justice. Dylan, the lawyer who had been helping us, moved to the front of the room. "According to the law," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, "what the HOA has done crosses several legal lines. We're talking about trespassing, property damage, environmental contamination, and conspiracy. This is no longer just a civil matter. It's criminal." He slid a folder across the table, revealing a detailed timeline of events, and the room fell silent as everyone looked at the evidence. "We have provable violations of HOA procedures," he continued. "Selective enforcement, illegal financial dealings, and now poisoning of a neighbor's property. This board has been operating outside the law for far too long." Judith, desperate, tried to regain control, her hands trembling as she pounded her gavel. "This meeting is about Mr. Mitchell's actions, not baseless accusations," she screamed, but no one listened. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it. Maria, a longtime resident of Pine Crest Gardens, stood up next, holding a copy of the original community covenant. "According to Article 7, Section 3, she said, her voice steady, "when 2/3 of homeowners are present, we can call for an immediate review of any board action or board member conduct. And as you can see, we've more than met that requirement. We are calling for a vote of no confidence in this board." As the homeowners raised their hands in agreement, Judith's face went pale. She knew what was coming. The vote passed by an overwhelming majority, and the board was officially removed from power. But Judith wasn't done yet. "You'll regret this," she hissed, glaring at me across the room. "I have friends you've never even heard of. You can't touch me." But I wasn't scared anymore. I had the community behind me. Judith's days of bullying and controlling Pine Crest Gardens were over. The day the vote was cast was a turning point for Pine Crest Gardens. The old HOA board, with its shady dealings and iron-fisted control, was gone. Judith Winters and her cronies were out, and a new sense of hope filled the air. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was alive again. People were speaking to each other in the streets, gardens were blooming, and the fear that had once held everyone captive was slowly starting to dissipate. I walked home that evening, my heart lighter than it had been in weeks. My garden was still suffering from the poison, but it would recover. And so would the neighborhood. We had fought for what was ours, and we had won. As I stepped into my yard, I saw Tom standing by the fence, holding a newspaper. He looked up as I approached, a smile spreading across his face. "Look at this," he said, showing me the front page. The headline read, "Local HOA Reform Becomes Model for County." Our story had spread beyond Pine Crest Gardens. People were starting to take notice of what had happened, and the idea of community-driven reform was gaining traction. Tom grinned. "People are starting to pay attention, James. We're making a difference." Later that evening, the new HOA board met for the first time. They were open and transparent, and the first thing they did was address the concerns of the community. They listened to the homeowners, asked for feedback, and most importantly, they promised to protect the rights of everyone in the neighborhood, not just the privileged few. I stood by my garden, looking out over the neighborhood. It was more than just a collection of houses now. It was a community, and it had been saved not by one person but by all of us. A few days later, I received a text from Marcus's daughter, Sophia. She had sent me a picture of the garden at the local botanical center, where Marcus was now working. His hands were dirty from gardening, and there, among the plants, were the heirloom tomatoes I thought I had lost forever. "They're using your seeds here," she wrote. I told them what happened. My dad's trying to make up for what he did. I smiled, a small sense of peace settling over me. Even Marcus, in his own way, was trying to right the wrongs he had committed. As the weeks went by, Pine Crest Gardens continued to flourish. My rainwater collection system was back in full operation, legal and celebrated by the new HOA. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now worked side by side in their gardens, sharing tips and produce. The community was united in a way I had never imagined. And as I walked through the neighborhood one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones worth fighting. The fight wasn't just about protecting my garden. It was about protecting the soul of the neighborhood. And in the end, we had won. In the end, Pine Crest Gardens became a model for what communities should be: transparent, fair, and united. We had stood up to the bullies, and in doing so, we had reclaimed not just our rights, but our sense of belonging. I had started the fight for my garden, but it had grown into something much bigger, a fight for everyone's freedom to live the way they chose, without fear of oppressive rules or retaliation. The lesson I learned was simple. One person standing alone can spark change. But when that one person is willing to fight for what's right, others will stand with them. Together, we can change the world. As the sun set over the now thriving community, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just my victory. It was our victory. And this was just the beginning.